Good evening. Tonight we're going to look at finding the simplest form of a fraction. All it really is a form of finding an equivalent fraction using division by the greatest common factor. Now, if you need a review of greatest common factor, you may want to go back. I do have an earlier video on finding greatest common factor, but we will be looking at how to use finding the greatest common factor to put a fraction in its simplest form tonight. So we're going to start with the idea here of simplest form. So right now I'd like to give you a definition. Okay, now that you've seen that very confusing definition, let's explain it for a second. What we're really saying with simplest form is when we have our equivalent fractions, in other words, earlier in the video right before this one, we talked about equivalent fractions being fractions that showed the same value while being divided up into common parts. For example, if I have 1/2 and instead I needed fourths, but I still want you to get your one whole piece, you would have gone from your 1/2. I would divide all the parts in 2. In other words, I'd be multiplying the number of parts by 2, which would then turn my denominator from, the 2 times 2 is 4, to 4, and the numerator from 1 to 2, because anything we do to the denominator, we do to the numerator as well, because we're cutting that whole object up, the parts we're using and the parts we aren't. So the simplest form is really the bottom of that group of equivalent fractions. It's the one that can no longer be divided down by any number other than 1. So that what we're really looking for is the numerator and denominator have no more common factors. They just aren't there anymore. We're going to look at some examples of that right now. So first off, I want to introduce what I like to call with the kids the quick checks. Because when you finally think you have found simplest form, you should still check it to make sure it really is simplest form. And while these 3 quick checks don't actually cover all possibilities, they do give you some of the more common results, and therefore, if you see these results, you can be fairly certain right then that you have found simplest form for that fraction. The reason for finding simplest form is to, again, kind of like with the mixed numbers and improper fractions, it's to make them more understandable. If I give you a large fraction like 14/21, well, that's a lot of pieces, that's a lot to keep track of, where if instead I said to you, oh, well, really that's 2/3, that's 2 out of 3 pieces, then it makes it a little easier to understand. So the whole point of simplest form is to reduce it to a fraction that we can better comprehend. Now, sometimes that's not possible due to the size of the fraction or if it turns out to be prime, but that is usually our goal. So these are 3 quick checks for whether or not you have found simplest form. Okay, quick check number 1, unit fractions. If you have reduced your fraction or simplified it to a fraction that has 1 in the numerator, you're done. You can't break a 1 up anymore. That piece has already been broken up. So if you hit a numerator of 1, that means whoever you're giving that piece to, that 1 piece, that's all the more they can get. You've really hit the bottom. There's nothing that will go into 1 and 7 or 1 and 9 or 1 and 3. They all have 1 in common, and that's it. Now, the reason this works is if I divide by 1, that again is that identity property. If I divide 1 by 1, I get 1. If I divide 7 by 1, I get 7. In other words, the fraction's not going to change. So that's just a quick way to say, oh yes, if there's 1 in the numerator, you're done. That's simplest form. A second way is that if there is a difference of 1 between the numerator and the denominator. So what that really means, and we'll flip the page here to look at some examples, if I end up with fractions like these at the top, if I end up with 3/4, you'll notice the numerator is 1 less than the denominator. The numerator, 1 less than the denominator. 1 less than the denominator. Because it's a difference of 1, the only number that you could divide both of these by would be 1. If there had been a difference of 2, there would be that possibility that 2 could go into both of them. But with a difference of 1, you're left with only 1 as an option to divide by. And again, if you divide by 1, you're not going to change the fraction at all. The third one, you have to know your prime numbers. Now remember, a prime number is a number that the only factors it has are 1 in itself. So when the denominator ends up being a prime number like 7, 13, or 11, the only numbers that are going to go into those are 7, 13, and 11. Unless the numerator is exactly the same as the denominator, or larger, which would then make it an improper fraction, we wouldn't really be simplifying it, you can't divide these. You can't divide by anything because 4 will never go into 7. 7's prime. 10 will never go into 13 because 13 is prime. 6 will never go into 11. Now that does not work if the numerator is prime. If the numerator is prime, for example, if I had a fraction like, let's say 3/12. Well, 3 is prime, but 3 will go into 12. So while the denominator being a prime will say you're in simplest form, the numerator being prime doesn't necessarily mean that, because you could divide by a number, the actual numerator, and still get a simpler number. For example, with the 3/12, 3 goes into 3 one time, and 3 goes into 12 4, so you get 1/4. So it could have been reduced. So again, that's only when it's in the denominator will that work. All right. We're going to look at 3 ways to go about simplifying fractions. Now we're talking about simple fractions here. Mixed numbers or improper fractions. In a mixed number, you can simply follow these same steps I'm about to show you, but just do it with the fraction. You can actually use these steps for an improper fraction, but in the end, you're still going to turn it into a mixed number, so you're really following those mixed number steps still. So let's take a very simple fraction here, 14/21. There are 3 ways we could go about finding simplest form for 14/21. The goal is always to find the greatest common factor. And in an earlier video, we talked about greatest common factor. Greatest common factors, again, are the largest number that both the numerator and denominator can be divided by. So that's the largest number they both have in common that they can be divided by. If you divide by that number, you will be in simplest form, because that's the largest number that can be taken out of both of them. At that point, the numbers they are left with aren't going to have anything in common other than 1. You've taken away everything else. So option 1 is that T-chart we looked at in an earlier video. I take the 14 and I collect its factors. And remember, we said stay organized. 1 times 14 are factors of 14. 2 times 7, factors of 14. 21, 1 times 21, factors of 21. 3 times 7, factors of 21. The one that they have in common, now be careful, I shouldn't say it that way. The largest number they have in common is the number that is the greatest common factor. And in this case, it's 7. So you'll see I made note of that. The GCF, greatest common factor, is equal to 7. And then here at the bottom, I divide both the numerator and the denominator by 7. Remember, when you're dividing this up, you're dividing up the whole object. That's the 21 pieces. But in the process of dividing up all the pieces, you're also dividing up the ones you're using, the other 14 here. So we divide them both by 7 for a final fraction of 2/3. So option 1 is the T-chart. And a lot of the kids like the T-chart, but you have to stay organized, because what we have found is when you start doing a guessing test more, where you're jumping all over, you're going to miss some of those factors, and it's real easy to miss that one number that would have been the greatest common factor. If you miss it, now you're into a process of, okay, I had to divide by 2, and I still don't have simplest form. Now I've got to try 2 or 3, and I still may not have simplest form. And you're going to sit there trying numbers over and over again. And while the kids sometimes think that's faster, in truth, it's not. That's actually going to take more time. At this point, I'm going to have to break. This is going over to a second video. So in the second video, we'll start looking at steps 2 and 3, which deal with prime factorization.